Well, in fact, Suesha, before I just take our viewers through the big takeaways of the G20 under India's presidency, a lot has been spoken as far as the Delhi Declaration is concerned. One aspect being that whether at all this is a little watered down when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine war. What has really changed as to why exactly has the Western nations accepted the Delhi Declaration as far as the Russia-Ukraine war, the paragraphs that have been, dedicated to Russia-Ukraine war. A direct comparison with Bali Declaration, of course, it is way more if you really look at the amount of discussion that has essentially taken place. But what entails, the final Delhi Declaration? How exactly is the West really looking at it? Joining me right now on this broadcast is Manas Chawla. He's part of the G20 research group based out of London, if I'm not wrong. Manas, just a quick response as far as the Delhi Declaration is concerned. At least till yesterday morning, few of the delegates that I spoke to, they weren't really very optimistic that there would be a full 100% consensus Delhi Declaration with regards to the Russia-Ukraine war. What has really changed for the Western nations for a climb down as far as the Russia-Ukraine war is concerned?
Sure. I think there's two big things. I mean, firstly, the need for a communique was immense, right? If there wasn't a communique, then Prime Minister Modi would be the first leader of the G20 to not produce a summit document, and it'd be known as a failure. So the need to produce something was very important. And what they have come up with is, like you noted, extremely watered down, even compared to Bali, which was met with a lot of critical voices back then. This one makes no explicit reference to Russia in paragraph 7 to 11, and it really leans on the United Nations Security Council resolutions to speak about in very general terms, abandoning the sort of illegitimate use of force. So, there's been some agreement on other topics, and pushing that forward is super important, particularly on climate as well. There's been a lot of criticism. We've seen no real statement on the phasing out of fossil fuels, as was agreed under COP15 in Paris in 2015. So there's still quite a few issues to be discussed.
But Manas, one view would be whether at all this Delhi Declaration is watered down pertaining to Russia-Ukraine war. The other way of looking at it is that the Bali Declaration, as External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar was pointing out, Bali is Bali, New Delhi is New Delhi. A lot of water has flown under the bridge since then. The situation is far different than what it was. Of course, the war is still underway, but having said that, the consequence of the war, what exactly the Prime Minister here has been talking about, that one cannot wish away the fact that there is a real consequence as far as the war is concerned, and that's exactly what the Delhi Declaration is really addressing. So the question here is that something must have changed as far as the opinion or the thought process of the G7 nations are concerned. Otherwise, they wouldn't have really accepted it. The fact that they have accepted it, they do believe that things are certainly changing when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine war.
Things are certainly changing, and things are in a very different spot today than they were a year ago. Currently, a resolution in the near term looks near impossible. But the Western nations also know that to get anything produced, whether that's on climate financing, multilateral development banks, or other parts of the summit, all the leaders have to agree on all parts of the communique. And so I suspect that these negotiations went on really until the last minute, into the early hours of Saturday morning. What exactly changed their mind is yet to be determined, but what I found from insider sources within the Indian ministries is that lots of countries spoken to individually, delegates were taken and were spoken to about different parts of the communique. And what was really stressed is that this G20 can't be a divided house at a time when geopolitical tension and the macroeconomic situation of the world is so precarious. The world really needs to come together, especially now that it represents an even larger proportion with the African Union. The G20 comprises 90% of the world's population.
Do you believe that somewhere down the line that the G7 nations, they've been pushed, they're all, I would like to place it this way, that perhaps for the G7 nations right now, it is to have the larger picture.
Yeah.
To quote what Japan had to say, that if at all you want an indispensable partner, a partner which is going to act as a balancer, it has to be India. French diplomats echoed the same, indicating that perhaps today India is in a position where they are they could actually bring in all nations together on the same very table, different opinion, but at the same time have that balancing impact.
Sure.
And perhaps the world today requires that role to be played. Do you believe that we are perhaps moving towards a direction where India could play the mediator when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine war?
Sure. I mean, if you look at the challenges that we're trying to address in this summit, more than ever, there are challenges that need to be addressed both by the global south and the global north. And this is a very different world, which was previously dominated by the neoliberal ethic, dominated again by the global north. And so addressing these challenges means really working with developing countries. And there's a lot of developing countries. They need a voice. And India has effectively taken up the stand for that with the inclusion of the African Union, but also the Global Voices Summit, which happened previously with 125 different countries. They're making sure that those voices are represented on the international scale, and those are particularly important, especially when we talk about the biggest existential crisis of all time, the climate emergency. Talking there about a just climate transition is extremely important, and India is always emphasizing that the standards that have been imposed by the West need to be adjusted when we talk about developing countries.
Of course, Ukraine wouldn't really be very happy with this declaration. There are murmurs about it. But having said that, it is time for the West to also understand that you cannot perhaps egg Ukraine any further when it comes to this war. There has to be a midpoint. Russia too perhaps will have to come to at least the drawing board to understand that this cannot continue any further. There is a direct impact as far as food security is concerned, fuel, or for that matter even fertilizer, and that is exactly why the Prime Minister has been talking about that a neutral position is extremely important. Do you believe that there would be a changed perspective from the G7 nations? I see it as that at some point in time their back is pushed to the wall.
Look, there's two crucial things to know. It's not only the G7 that's concerned about it. Like you rightly pointed out, the conflict is happening in Ukraine, but it affects quite literally the rest of the world. We've never seen a more globalized war in our lifetimes. This impacts food insecurity through the Black Sea Grain Initiative in parts of Africa. It impacts gas prices in the rest of Europe. It impacts political relationships with the rest of the world. So it's really important in that particular way. As for whether or not the G7 nations are backed up against the wall, the conflict has gone on right now for much longer than we initially expected, which means that the bargaining power of some of these countries has been radically reduced. Ukraine is currently struggling to get the armament supplies, the political support it needs. And I think the really crucial thing to watch out for is the following G7 summit in Italy to get an exact picture of what the G7 thinks. But here, we won't get any real opinions because it's all been the consensus of the G20 leaders, which is a much wider, much more globalized picture.
One quick question before I let you go, Manas, is that how is the West really looking at this? Is it because they believe that they had no other option but to ensure that India succeeds with this presidency, or do you believe that this is work in progress? What we saw in Bali soon after the declaration, perhaps within a month, it was frayed, it was broken down. A lot of the commitments were not really followed up. Do you believe, as what Brazil has already indicated, there would be an extension of what we are seeing as far as the G20 presidency of India is concerned, which would be taken forward by Brazil? Do you believe that the West is viewing this in a very different manner?
If you look at what has changed after Bali, it's actually very little. In the global economic picture, in the global geopolitical picture. But one trend much larger than the G20 that's been going on is the emergence of these middle powers, or these rising powers, and India is leading that pack. These are countries like India, Indonesia, Turkey, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates. They are now more important than ever because they're pivot powers. They do business with the Chinese, they have a military relationship with the Americans, a political relationship with the Europeans. And now that means that they're more important to solve all sorts of global challenges, which is exactly why the West has to reframe its thinking, and is currently reframing its thinking, as we see from this communique, in being a bit more amenable to the global South's demands, a bit more amenable to their priorities. And it's a trend that I think will continue for a much, much longer time to come.
Thank you very much, Manas, for joining us on this broadcast. It was a pleasure having you. In fact, as Manas was also pointing out, there are changing perspectives also as far as the West is concerned, or for that matter, how India is essentially leading what Manas calls the entire pack from the Middle East. And that is certainly crucial when you look at it from the larger gamut at this stage.